Okay, so welcome back to the Razor Sharp Report. I'm Bold Like a Leopard, and I always want to remind you to check me out in the description. Find my podcast on all of the different social media apps, or also the video hosting apps, so Rumble, BitChute, and Odyssey. I want you to start going there because obviously we're starting to see some real blossoming of the potential for these alternatives to YouTube. And in any case, you're probably not getting the notifications for my YouTube videos if you're only subscribed to me there, so go ahead and do that. I'm probably going to be putting out an article in the next few days, and it's just been a very hectic week, very hectic work schedule, but of course I did want to give you my post-mortem, or I guess preliminary one, for the 2022 midterm elections. Now, I've been saying for the past few weeks that the real problem I have is that people are putting too much stock in this. They think that if we flip this seat, or if we change this person out for a different person and change the color on a certain position, that's really going to be the solution to what's happening in America, where we're seeing consistent decay and real systematic abuse and corruption, and also severe weakness in the economy, which I think is the real story that we're going to be dealing with in the next few weeks ahead. There's going to be a lame duck session in Congress. It doesn't matter which party comes out on top, and a lot of people are going to be distracted by that. And they're going to come back to reality really fast because, we're not dealing with an easy situation in terms of the economy. And a lot of money was actually wasted on this election that ought to have been spent for other things, for things that were more useful. But of course, people who want to stay close to the trough and want to stay in touch with the people in power, they need to keep those people in power. And that's why I think we saw such a mixed message in yesterday's election. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I thought it was just a bad result. And there are some bright spots, but really, in order to make it a good election, I do think it had to be a red, dead rejection of the Democratic agenda. And it's not only for the reason that I think President Biden needs to be restrained. It's also because I think in many of these states, people need a little bit of relief. They need a new path forward, a new person to show them there's a different way. And I'm going to go through several of the elections. What were the big disappointments? What were the ones that I thought were potential rays of light? And what I think has to be done going ahead. So we are going to focus a lot more on the midterm today than on the markets, which I will mention today were all down by a significant margin, probably because of the uncertainty, and not easy to know how much that momentum will stick, because it could be that tomorrow there could be some sort of change and the House will flip red officially, and potentially the Senate as well. Now, that's one of the big problems that we have coming out of the midterm, the uncertainty, because there are states that are out there that can't conduct an election like a modern nation. Those states would be Arizona, California, Alaska. Alaska may have some explanation, but it's, whatever. Get your act together. Nevada. So those states, for some reason, they can't have an election within a 24-hour period. They have, and believe me, some people will say, "Oh, you're just one of these people who's a denier." No, if you go to elections around the world, whether it's in France, whether it was in Brazil, whether it was in, I'm trying to think another recent one, in Italy, they've had elections within 24 hours. And don't give me the bullshit that Italy is more modern than the United States. Come on. So, come on, man. So, it's really frustrating when you have to stay up all night. And that's one of the reasons I didn't stream, because I knew that the stream would just keep going on, and there'd be nothing more for me to report. And that's the way some of the streams that I was listening to were. So I finally quit at about 2 a.m. and went to bed, because I have work in the morning, and most Americans do. And that's why I think that they don't care, because they know most people will stop paying attention overnight because people have other shit to do. They can't depend on these losers who run the election system to actually do their job right. So those people don't care whether they do it right. And you should look at, we're going to get to Pennsylvania, but a lot of these videos that came out from Project Veritas, 2 of them were relating to Pennsylvania, where in one case you had a pair of keys that were for a drop-off ballot box that were found on top of it. And the reporter actually alerted an election worker, and the election worker said that I was told not to engage with you, and then wouldn't actually check whether the keys matched the drop box, right? And that's one of the big, I mean, it's a red flag over there. How do you know? How do you know that these people are actually caring about conducting a free and fair election if they're not even pretending that they're doing it? Another video, pretty disturbing, from the Philly election was some Project Veritas reporter talking to a poll worker who actually instructed him how to vote straight Democratic ticket. And she actually said, after he asked the question, do I vote for this candidate? No, you vote for the other one, because we want him to win, because, so poll workers actively pushing for candidates, that should have been a major red flag. You also had another poll worker who came up and said the same thing while he was talking to this woman poll worker who was a Chinese translator at the polling station in Philadelphia. So clearly people need to be aware that, yes, there are questions of voter integrity and election integrity in Pennsylvania. You can't just go and say, oh, you lost and you have to eat crow in this case, because when you have video of poll workers behaving like this, there's no way that you can actually convince anyone fair-minded that this was a free, lawful, and fair election. And that's why today John Fetterman is senator-elect from Pennsylvania. Another reason might also be because Dr. Oz wasn't a great candidate. The other major statewide candidate in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano, whatever you want to think of him, I think he would be a great governor, but he was not going to win. And, you could blame whoever you want. You could blame Donald Trump for backing Doug Mastriano. A lot of state Republicans did. A number of state Republicans actually endorsed his opponent, Shapiro, over Doug Mastriano. So those morons who broke away from the party and endorsed Shapiro, they're going to have to justify to themselves, maybe they don't care, why Pennsylvania is going to continue to be under the thumb of these corrupt assholes, people like Josh Shapiro, who don't actually care about having a justice system that punishes the criminals and helps find justice for people who are victims of violence. Instead, Pennsylvania, I think, is going to become a real banana republic. It already has been under the current administration of Governor Wolf. And, there's not much positive I have to say about Pennsylvania at the moment. It's proven to be one of those states where you can't believe anything that the people in power say. And I wonder exactly what's going to happen to a lot of the people that live there. They might decide, if the cost of living there becomes too heavy, to migrate into some of the surrounding states. Even I would question, they might migrate into Maryland. As hard as it is to believe. Certainly we have a few people who come to Ohio from Pennsylvania. I know a few. So what about some other states? So yeah, Fetterman defeated Oz. I think Dr. Oz was a flawed candidate. It was a terrible idea that the Trumps had, to back Dr. Oz. And they should have known better. They should have probably supported somebody who had a longer track record in the state, maybe been through some of this, through a few campaigns at least, maybe in some sort of capacity. It's not always easy to find people that are reliable candidates, and I'm sure that some of the people that try to get the blessing from Trump don't pass muster because of maybe some questions that arise about them. But there were two other candidates that were running in Pennsylvania that he could have backed. I mean, instead he supported Dr. Oz, who was a celebrity, and he didn't. I mean, he did well enough to remain within a respectable margin, but that doesn't matter at this point. Dr. Oz lost to a person who's clearly unqualified to be working in any public position that requires him to talk to the public. John Fetterman is going to be a puppet of whoever's behind him, whether it's the Democratic National Committee or the other people in the Senate. And that really shows how sad the state of American democracy is. So, yeah, people want to talk about democracy being in danger. Electing John Fetterman endangers American democracy. If you want to call America a democracy, how do you justify a democracy where a person who only days before the election said that he rejoiced at the overturning of Roe v. Wade when he really meant that his opponent did, and he couldn't articulate what he wanted to say. And it doesn't matter. People want to say you're being cruel. Why don't you just be civil and let it go? Obviously, he has a health problem. Yeah, the health problem is an inhibition on his ability to do his job. Dr. Oz at least could form complete sentences. Now, would you believe things that he said? Maybe not. But that's not the issue. The issue is that John Fetterman was unfit to hold the office of U.S. Senator, and he will be the next U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. And I guess we'll get to enjoy that show. So the next race I want to talk about, I want to talk about in Iowa. We're having to look at this race, what happened with Chuck Grassley. People were hyping it up that Grassley was vulnerable because he's much older, and people have questions about whether he really deserves another term. He's been in the Senate for so long. He ended up just blasting his Democratic opponent out of the sky, Mike Franken, who was an admiral, a Navy admiral. So Chuck Grassley is going to be in the Senate for I don't know how long, but certainly the Democrats have a lot to be disappointed about from that race, because they invested a lot of money in Mike Franken, and they've also lost in Iowa their last House seat. So Iowa has turned completely red. You also have Florida turning very much red. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You have in Kansas, another disappointment for the GOP. You had their governor, Laura Kelly, won re-election. She's a Democrat. So I think that you certainly have many points around the country where Republicans have to look at themselves and say, how did we drop the ball on so many races? Now, maybe Laura Kelly actually is popular, but then you have to ask yourself, what the hell did happen to Kansas that they re-elected a governor like her who won't take a firm stand on issues like whether transgender athletes can compete in women's sports? I think there has to be a campaign among Republicans to really emphasize that you have to talk to voters and tell them that the people at the top of the ballot often can make the difference between your state being a destination and being a place to escape. And I don't think Kansas is close to that. I think certainly they had a few other bright spots in that election, but they definitely underperformed. This was a state, Kansas, where, by the way, the Dobbs decision, I think, may have affected the vote. Now, I don't think abortion changed the election everywhere, but it certainly did in some states, and Kansas would be one of them. And I would say that were it not for the Dobbs decision, Laura Kelly might have been defeated in Kansas. So would I rather have a Democratic governor than Roe v. Wade overturned? No, I think that the sanctity of life, the ability to say that we as a country are able to restrict abortion, which I think is a barbaric act, I think that's more important than having another Republican in the governor's office of Kansas, because ultimately she's going to be limited as far as what she can do, and there's other elements of the government of Kansas that can limit her. Okay, and I think the Republicans did win the Secretary of State race over there. I think they won the Attorney General race in Kansas. In other states, it's a bit more of a muddled picture. Okay, New York. I want to say sorry for the people of New York that Lee Zeldin lost the election. He came actually remarkably close, and it would have been interesting to see if some of the people who had left New York in the past couple years and moved to other states, like my state, Ohio, or Florida, or I don't know, some of them might have moved to New Jersey or Connecticut. If those people had remained citizens of New York, would the race have been closer? Now, of course, one of the reasons that they left New York was because the incumbent, Kathy Hochul, and Andrew Cuomo were so terrible. People have been leaving New York since before the Great Recession, I think. I think the Great Recession really triggered it, because so many businesses closed down in upstate New York, and it never truly recovered from that recession, at least the region of upstate New York. And people are starting to realize, I believe, that they've elected a government that is going to leave them in poverty. So there's a mixed message in New York. Yeah, Kathy Hochul got reelected, but there was a major House seat gain. Sean Patrick Maloney, who was the biggest, he was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, also known as the DCCC. So he lost his race. He actually conceded today. And that effectively means that people aren't happy with the Democrats either. So you don't have the red wave that was promised, but you also don't have exactly the shining knight for the Democrats that many of their supporters had hoped for. And I would say that one big takeaway from this race is that polling is going to be increasingly distrusted nowadays. It's going to be distrusted on both sides of the aisle. Democrats aren't going to trust it, and Republicans aren't going to trust it, because really, who would have guessed at this conclusion? In the last few days, it looked like there would be a massive red wave. Only weeks earlier, it looked like there would be a blue oblivion, or whatever you want to call it. It was a very confusing race. And certainly polling agencies are going to probably feel a lot of wrath about this. But yeah, New York, you had Mark Molinaro, I believe, is close to being elected in upstate New York. And so New York, on the whole, I believe, drifted a little bit to the right in this election, or to the center, I should say. They're not going to be a right-wing state, but there's a lot of signs that New York State is fixing to undergo a real transformation in the next few years, and that Kathy Hochul shouldn't be too happy about this result, because what happens next? Now she actually has been elected. She has to actually deliver for the people of New York, and the emperor has no clothes. She's going to have to govern with Eric Adams. They're going to have to try to get their handle on crime and on a lot of the economic mess that's happening. That's another bigger message I want to deliver here, which is that in some ways, this is a tough pill to swallow, but in some ways, if you are a partisan Republican, not winning everything yesterday during the midterms might be a blessing in disguise. Because if the economy takes the massive dive that I think it's about to do, they're not going to be able to blame the Republicans, because the Republicans are only going to have probably control of the House. They might have control of the Senate by a narrow margin, but In many cases, especially if the Democrats retain control of the Senate, the Republicans are going to say, well, what do you want from us? We weren't able to ever pass our own budget. And that's what they should continue to say. They should say that anything that the White House is trying to tell you about the GOP being responsible for this terrible economy, which they are for different reasons, is false. The Democrats had control of both houses of Congress. They could have pushed through any budget that they wanted. And if it was a responsible budget, then maybe things would have worked, but they didn't. They pushed through some crazy ideas. They pushed through Build Back Better, and the fruits of that economic policy are going to be felt in the very near future. So I think people who are down on populist right and how they didn't really meet expectations during this election, I think they have to lick their wounds and realize that what would have been won. Basically, the next Congress has to oversee one of the most challenging economic situations that we've ever seen. Maybe the most challenging economic situation ever. And it could be that the coming crash will leave the Democrats in such a terrible situation that the real red wave will only hit in 2024. And that would be something to behold. You have to remember in the 30s, after the Great Depression hit, Herbert Hoover did lose Congress right away, but that was only after his bumbling basically verified to the people that this guy didn't have the goods. He wasn't able to handle the situation. So the Democrats seized control of Congress. Then they completely swept him out of power in 1932, and that ushered in the Roosevelt era. That ushered in, by the way, the era of big government in America. Before 1932, you did have government spending. You did have problematic issues like the Federal Reserve and the income tax coming into play that had started in the World War I era. But largely you had a government that was fairly limited in its scope of intervention in the economy. But slowly that started to encroach, and when it really got out of control was under Roosevelt. And the person who unlocked the door for Roosevelt was Herbert Hoover, who did try to do interventionist economics. He tried to, he did institute things like price controls when he was president. And therefore, when FDR took over, all he did was say, everything that Hoover did, I'm going to do much more of, because that was a real problem. It wasn't the intervention, it was the fact that there wasn't enough intervention. Let's intervene more, because the intervention that we've done up until now hasn't worked. So let's just keep doing it harder. And that's why the Great Depression took a lot longer to solve itself than it had to. So next race, not to get off on too far of a tangent on that, we're going to talk about Florida. So Florida turned out to be the real cyanide pill for the Democrats on the night. And believe me, I think some of them are trying to cope by looking at the rest of the country and saying that Florida is just one isolated case and the rest of the country is A-okay. But that's not really what I see. Florida was a case where you had a governor who really was aggressive. He went on the offensive. And I think that Ron DeSantis's big thumping of his opponent, Charlie Crist, whose career is over. He'll forever be known as the guy who lost the governor's mansion because he wanted to run for Senate and got destroyed by Marco Rubio in 2010. And then he tried to come back and lost another governor's race to Rick Scott, who became another senator, and then decided that he wanted the governor's mansion again, and lost to Ron DeSantis, who may one day, who knows, become either a senator or the president. Time will tell. But I think that we're genuinely going to see big things to come from the state of Florida in the future. Rubio likely won't be a presidential candidate. I don't think that he has the national following that's needed, but Marco Rubio also won a victory that was incredibly, lopsided against his opponent, Val Demings. And this was despite many predictions and polls that were, for weeks and even up to the election. Now it started to drift away at the end. And people were starting to say, yeah, Rubio is really starting to pull away. But I don't think people really expected Rubio to win by, I think it was like 17 points. And basically it showed that really all of this hype about Val Demings, that liberal press outlets were basically blowing a lot of smoke up her ass. All this hype about other candidates in Florida, and now they're talking about this one guy who's a Gen Z candidate who won, who's a Democrat. That I think is they're trying to put lipstick on a pig. But Florida, and actually somebody else used that analogy about Florida earlier today, so sorry if I'm repeating it, but there's just no other way to look at it. They can't put lipstick on it. They can't shine up this turd and make it look like a piece of shit. Florida is a terrible situation for the Democrats. They've basically lost all statewide offices. There was actually a bulletin during the coverage that this is the first time since Reconstruction that not a single Democrat has been elected statewide in Florida. Now, I don't know how they do their Supreme Court justices. We'll get to Ohio and North Carolina soon. But it basically means that the Democratic Party has, in the space of about 8 or 9 years, lost all of their relevance in the state of Florida. They have, of course, several congressional districts where they're still the party because, and they'll say that it's because of gerrymandering. Never mind that if you look at the state of Illinois, the Democrats, the only way that they can explain what happened in Illinois is because of gerrymandering. Speaking of which, so let's talk about North Carolina. North Carolina has been ground zero for a big battle between the parties in recent years, and a lot of it's been in the court. And all this talk about voter suppression and about whether the gerrymandering is keeping the black vote down and all of that. Well, this past election is going to be, I think, a big indicator of where North Carolina lays. They tried to elect re-elect several Democratic judges at the Supreme Court level in North Carolina, and they all got swept. So the Republicans will now control the North Carolina Supreme Court, meaning that many of these court cases regarding gerrymandering are simply going to be rendered moot, or they're going to be decided in the GOP's favor. And then if the Democrats try to appeal, that ends up going to the Supreme Court, and you can probably understand where that's going to go soon after that. Gerrymandering as an issue in elections is something that cuts both ways, and I'm not going to deny that gerrymandering happens on state levels, but for people to blame what happened in Florida on gerrymandering is simply, being in denial. The Democrats lost there because they ran a terrible campaign and they picked terrible candidates like Charlie Crist. Val Demings probably not as bad of a candidate as Charlie Crist, but also really she had no business trying to pass herself off as a candidate who was going to win against Marco Rubio. So this was a race where in North Carolina, to compare it, where it was a similar pattern. The media was trying to say that there's a very competitive race between Ted Budd, the Republican trying to succeed Richard Burr, and Sherry Beasley, who had been a Supreme Court justice on North Carolina's Supreme Court. And in the end, Budd actually won in a fairly convincing fashion. And at the moment, North Carolina is, while there are signs that the Democrats aren't completely cooked there, they only have one statewide officer. They have the governor, Roy Cooper. I can't, for the love of me, of everything, understand why North Carolinians re-elected Roy Cooper in 2020 and elected him in 2016. It might be because they're dissatisfied with the state party in North Carolina, or there must be something about Roy Cooper that keeps them going back to him. But in 2024, when there's a new gubernatorial election there, you can expect that there's going to be a new sheriff in town. His name is probably Mark Robinson, and at that point, Dan Forest was his opponent, but Roy Cooper is going to be term limited. So that's going to be an interesting sight to see, 2020 in North Carolina. And moving on from there, you have also in Ohio, we're going to go to my home state. You had an election where the Democrats were hyping up another candidate, Tim Ryan. Now, their gubernatorial race in Ohio was a sleeper. Okay, there was no actual suspense, and everybody knew that Governor Mike DeWine, who I didn't vote for, I actually wrote in my dog's name, so I have that much contempt for Mike DeWine. I consider him basically like Tyrion Lannister, but without any of the interesting personality or intelligence. So he lost my confidence when he decided to do the vaccine lottery. This was something that happened in 2021. It had to be in 2021 because that's when the vaccine was being unveiled. And he said, yeah, there's $1 million lottery that you enter into when you get the vaccine in the state of Ohio. So you're basically telling people to gamble with their own health in the interests of hyping your own vaccine policy because you want to get as many people vaccinated because you want your poll numbers up. That's why Mike DeWine, in my opinion, was such a heartless piece of crap, and I'll never support him. And people who voted for him, I don't understand. Many of them, they like to tell me, well, what about, he's the lesser of two evils, and what if what's her name would have gotten to office, his opponent, Nan Whaley. First of all, that wasn't going to happen. So I didn't have any guilt about it because it was basically a safe race, and I didn't care. But second of all, Mike DeWine didn't deserve to be governor after doing something like that. He's supposed to look after the health and welfare of the people of the state as best as he can. That I guess was his position during the pandemic, when he used to tell people to stay at home and not do anything, when he wanted to issue stay-at-home orders and shelter in place and force people to not go anywhere, but he couldn't because the GOP state legislature wouldn't give him the powers to do so. And they try to put blocks on his emergency powers in order to prevent him from really flexing his muscles. But otherwise, Mike DeWine would have been another Andrew Cuomo. And unfortunately, we're going to have him again for another 4 years until he's term limited and we get a real governor in here. Maybe for once in our lives, we'll get a good governor in Ohio, because we haven't. Doesn't matter what party they're in. We've had terrible governors my entire life. Except maybe for George Voinovich, who was the governor when I was a little kid. Besides that, there was the big Senate race, and there was also a major sweeping of the Supreme Court by the Republicans. So Ohio is moving further and further into the Republican camp, just like Florida. So in the Senate race, you had Tim Ryan, Mr. Miller Lite, Yosemite Sam, who filmed a 15-second commercial showing himself firing a handgun at some targets outside, and then looking at the grouping and saying, not bad for a Democrat. And he was thinking, oh, this is going to help me get a few Republican votes at the last minute, because of course they're going to think that I'm down with the pew-pew. But it didn't work, and it was too little too late for Tim Ryan, and it actually was. Now, it was certainly less of a convincing victory for Tim Ryan than the other race that happened, the gubernatorial race. Mike DeWine stomped his opponent in the gubernatorial race. J.D. Vance won in convincing fashion, but it was only, I think, about 6.5 points, which is actually less than what Trump won Ohio by. And J.D. Vance will be the next senator from Ohio. I'm not going to say much more about that. I don't have any problem with J.D. Vance in general, and I did vote for him. But Tim Ryan is going to end up, being remembered as one of these candidates who pandered as hard as he could pander and tried to pivot so far to the center that he went dizzy and lost the election. And many people are going to try to spin it as him having the right attitude, because that's the only way that you can win as a Democrat in Ohio in 2022, even though he didn't win. So you'll have to recognize that even though he lost the election, I do believe that there will be people out there who will say, well, he lost the election, but, he got much closer than these other people who were on the ticket the same year as him. So, we ought to give him another try. No. And there's a very simple reason why, if you're a Democrat, I don't know who you should pick, but Tim Ryan is not really as good of an option as they're telling you. The reason that he isn't is because in his own home district and area, the Mahoning Valley, Tim Ryan actually lost both counties, Mahoning County and also Trumbull County, which is where he lives. And that is saying something. These are districts that it is a district, and it's 2 counties that he's represented for 20 years in Congress. So you have to imagine, this is a guy that the media is trying to say he has the common touch and people love him because he's blue collar and he's for the workers and the steel plants and the auto plants and the machine shops and the people who work construction. That's who backs Tim Ryan. Well, if that really is the case, then why is it most of the counties that he won were the big urban areas, places like Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, and he lost his own home counties, which are Mahoning and Trumbull, and he didn't do particularly well in Lorain County, which is a heavily organized labor county. The reason is that I think even organized labor people, and I'm not a big fan of organized labor, but even they have started to recognize that his shtick was totally fake. And J.D. Vance was able actually to harness a lot of the skepticism of Tim Ryan by saying, yeah, he's been in Congress all these years, and you've watched all these jobs disappear. I think at one point in the 1980s, Ohio had, or it might have been earlier in the 70s, Ohio had something like 22 congressional seats. We're down to 15 now because of the population loss. And it's because people like Tim Ryan and people like our other senator, Sherrod Brown, have been in power all these years, and they seem to think that their policies on labor and their policies on the economy and on spending, that they're going to make Ohio a winning economy. And it just hasn't panned out because they keep trying to do the same thing over and over again. So in 2024, it's my sincere hope we put up a candidate to vote Sherrod Brown out of office. Sherrod Brown, in my opinion, is a bigger Tim Ryan than Tim Ryan is. He's like the same thing. Like you ever go to? Do you remember ever playing in Super Mario, the game, and you go up against all these turtles and the Koopas, as they called them, and you knock them out, and then finally you get to the big one, Bowser. Well, Sherrod Brown is the Bowser of Tim Ryan's, and Tim Ryan is just a little mini Koopa. So that's what I have to say about that race. The 2024 is what I am looking forward to if we live to see that day and don't get nuked by other foreign powers, is to see Sherrod Brown basically be knocked out and have Ohio turn into just as red of a state as Florida. We're not quite as red of a state because in 2018, Sherrod Brown won a convincing victory in his Senate race over there. It should have turned red that year. I hope it does this year, or this coming cycle in 2024. And I'll be eagerly awaiting that. And I'll be happy if it does. I want to live to see that day when Sherrod Brown is basically kicked out of his perch, and finally his wife, who's a reporter for USA Today, is rendered just to being the wife of a former senator instead of the wife of a senator. By the way, she's a person who all the time would make a lot of noise about how she's the wife of a senator. She writes articles. I think she even wrote a book about being the wife of a senator. So we should try to make it so that she can't say that anymore, because otherwise she doesn't really have a career that I think is remarkable in any way. Anyway, so other races, I'm actually getting close to home. Wisconsin, you had a very close nail-biter, a very big disappointment in their gubernatorial race. Tony Evers is surviving, and he'll be governor for another 4 years. It's the same issue that I see, where people have to figure out that your governor is pretty important. He should definitely have lost the race. And but the one key takeaway from Wisconsin is that their Senate race did not flip. So it will remain with Ron Johnson, the GOP candidate. So the Democrats have so far netted one Senate race. The Republicans have netted, I don't know how many House races so far, but it looks like they're set to take the House. 2 races that haven't gone final, Arizona and Nevada. Those 2 states, what has to happen if governors get elected in those 2 states, and secretaries of state, they have to go direct to the problem and say, we're not going to have this problem anymore where people have to wait weeks to find out what the election was, what the results were. It should happen within a few hours. It's something that was easy to do in Florida. It should be easy to do anywhere in the country. We don't live in the third world. So I do hope that Kari Lake carries the night in Arizona, and hopefully it is tonight, and she goes into there's signs that she should be in the lead pretty soon. And if she does, if Kari Lake wins, and if the Secretary of State of Arizona turns out to be the Republican candidate, Fincham, they should conduct a massive house cleaning in Arizona. This is a place where, despite what the media says, they fucked up in 2020. The Board of Elections, the Secretary of State's office in Arizona, they did it. Okay, they made it so that the election had to stretch on, and they created the doubts that pervade in our electoral system. Not the people who protested, not the people who went to the Capitol and protested on January 6th. Them. People like Katie Hobbs, the woman who is trying to be the governor of Arizona. She's responsible for a lot of this endangering of democracy, if you want to call it that. Another reason that she should be disqualified from ever holding any elective office is what she's done with elections since then. She had a primary earlier this year. That also took a whole week for people to know the full results. What's the explanation for that? There's no more pandemic to explain it. And now this again. So people have to start really asking what the hell Katie Hobbs did as Secretary of State. And there should be investigations that I think should border on, criminal negligence or something like that, because nobody should be allowed to abuse their office the way that she has. So that's what's it called? That's Arizona. In Nevada, it's looking at the moment like it's going to flip red, because it's been trending that way since yesterday. Now, I don't know what the explanation is for Nevada, but why is it that Nevada also has to wait? California, I do know there were blackouts there. I don't know if that's why they weren't able to get a result immediately, but I think that we're going to see, if Arizona flips red and you have Kari Lake as the governor. I don't know about Blake Masters, but I think Kari Lake is very close to being the governor of Arizona. That would be a major blow to the Democratic narrative that this was a failed election, because you're going to have somebody in power like Kari Lake with a friendly state legislature. You're also going to have a similar situation in Nevada. So both of those would be, I think, silver linings on what I think has been a very frustrating week. That's about it. I do hope to speak to you again in the near future. Please like, share, and subscribe, and make sure to find me at the link tree below on all the different social media and video hosting sites, whether it's Rumble, BitChute, or Odyssey, and then you have the other sites like Substack and Subscribestar. I'm on Getter. I'm on Tumblr. I'm not on Tumblr. I'm on Truth Social. I'm on what's the other one? Getter. I'm on all those. So check it out and subscribe here too, and ring that bell, and also press the thumbs up button and comment below. And I'll talk to you later. And go outside and have some fun and do something for yourself.